This man was a writer. He was an orator. He was a statesman. He was a U.S. Marshal. Heck, he was even a suffragist. This man went from the very, very bottom, where he was born, all the way to the top, where he once again said, I regained my independence, and I am no longer dependent on anybody for my accomplishments. Who would ever would think to imagine that this man was born a slave? That's right. Today's story is about Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a famous abolitionist in the United States. And this man, as I've mentioned, has gone from the very bottom all the way to the very top. And he wrote about his adventures, or his story, in an autobiography. Today I'd like to tell you a little bit about that, and we will go into scope from the beginning of the life of Frederick Douglass all the way to his mid-20s. We'll take away the lessons that he teaches us in the book, and we'll talk about the recurring themes so that we can take something away today. Most importantly, we will see why slavery is not only detrimental to the slaves themselves, but also to the slave owners. So let's get started. Frederick Douglass. This man is born in 1818 in Maryland. He's born on a great big farm called the Great Farmhouse. And the man who leads that house is Colonel Lloyd. Colonel Lloyd is a very rich guy. He has over 400 slaves that he owns in a very big place. So Frederick grows up. Now when Frederick is young, he's very confused. He asks, hey, when is my birth date? And everybody says, shh, don't ask that question. But he sees other kids have their birth dates, the ones that are not slaves. So he's very confused by this. When he's young, he's separated from his mother right at birth. He has not seen his mother at all until he was the age of 4 or 5. As he continues to grow up, he lives in pretty harsh conditions. Now think about it, this is Maryland. This is not Texas, where their winters is like our spring. This is Maryland. They have pretty cold winters, pretty cold summers. And all the slaves get is one garment of clothing per year. Luckily, he says he does not work in the fields. He's too young for it. He doesn't have enough strength, but he works in the household. Now, as he grows up, at the age of 7, Frederick gets transferred to another place. He doesn't just get transferred out. No, he just gets transferred to a new owner. Now, he's going to go live in Baltimore with the new owner. He takes a ship and sails. It takes 24 hours to get to Baltimore. He gets there. He finally knocks on the door. They open. And it's the Auld family that takes him in. At the door, he sees Hugh Auld, Thomas Auld, and Sophia Auld. That's his new family, who he will be a slave for. Now, at this point, Frederick is again confused. He sees Sophia Auld, and she radiates, she shines. She's so nice, she's kind. And he says, why is she so kind to me? I mean, it's so different from what he's used to. The thing is, Sophia Auld has never been exposed to the institution of slavery in the North. She just grew up as a regular person. She doesn't know the customs and the traditions of slavery. So, being a kind woman as she is, she treats him like a son. In fact, he's very, very thankful because she doesn't get any pleasure from him being subservient in the family. She also doesn't punish him when he makes eye contact with her, which is huge. He's not used to that. But most importantly, and something that he's very thankful for, is the fact that she takes him in and she starts to teach him the alphabet. She starts teaching him the alphabet and small words from a book. A little bit of literacy, which all the slaves were banished from. You couldn't do that. That was illegal. Now that was great until Hugh Auld came in one day and young Frederick was there. And Hugh Auld came up to Sophia and said, I forbid you to teach this boy any more words and literacy. Now, before this, young Frederick did not know why. He didn't know the scope of his life. He did not know who he was or why he was born this way. He just assumed that's just the way it is. I'm a slave and that's the way it is. Luckily, Hugh gave a little hint as to why that was. He told Sophia, we cannot teach the slaves because, first, they become unhappy. Second of all, they become unmanageable. Now, those are huge. Now he has a reason. Now he knows a little bit. That education is the key to him escaping this type of a life. Now, what happened afterwards is quite interesting because Sophia slowly turns from a kind person into a person who becomes cruel. In fact, young Douglass in his book goes to say as much as she becomes a victim of institutionalized slavery as much as he is, because it turns her character from a good character into a corrupt character. Something very important. So at this point, she becomes cruel, but his thirst for knowledge doesn't stop there. He goes on and he gives the poor boys some bread outside to help them learn how to read. She also practices in contests outside with the poor white kids to see who writes letters better, who has better penmanship. And this way he learns a little bit. While the adults are gone from their home, he takes up their books and he opens them up and he starts reading some of them. He starts to write a little bit by writing in the margins within the books. First he copies a couple of words, and then he starts to copy some of the dictionary words. He gets enough proficiency in the language to where he is at least functional to read. Not long after that, he gets transferred again to another family. Now in this family, the man of the house is fair, but he keeps the slaves in a malnourished state. He doesn't feed them very well. This forces young Frederick Douglass to go ahead and lose his horse all the time. Why would he do that? Well, he would do that because he would send him to find a horse, and young Douglass can go to another farm and take some food so he survives. As he beats him, young Douglass' spirit is not broken. He still has a strive to go for his education and get out of there, so he doesn't care how abused he gets physically. But at a certain point, the slave owner gets really annoyed, and he says, I'm going to transfer you for 1 year to go get some education. What he did was, he transferred Douglass to Mr. Covey. Mr. Covey was known as a slave breaker. He would take the problematic slaves who would rebel, and he would break their spirits and make them agreeable again. He lives there, and he says that was the most hellish 6 months of his life, although he lived there longer, because he had to work in the fields now, not in the household. And he wasn't used to fields, he was awkward with it. As he works there, Covey punishes him and tries to break his spirit. And at some point, Frederick Douglass is almost broken. He has no desire for learning. He just wants to commit suicide at this point. He doesn't want to live anymore. Until at one point, he was in the barn, and Covey tied him up on the floor. And he was about to whip him. And as he got the whip out, suddenly Douglass broke. He snapped, and he took his hand, and he took Covey by the throat and started holding him. Covey called one slave and said, help. One slave came up, Douglass kicked him aside. He called the second slave. The second slave came, Douglass kicked him aside. The third slave didn't answer. He didn't even come. At that point, two things happened. One, Frederick Douglass's spirit was not broken. He regained his confidence. And two, Covey never laid his hands on him again while he lived there. As the story goes on, Frederick finally, this was within 2 years, on his third time he was able to escape. Whoa, I just killed the enemy, right? You're probably asking, well, how did he escape? Come on, don't just kill it like that. I'm sorry, I don't know. The thing is, Frederick Douglass, when he wrote his autobiography, he didn't give that description in his book because he knew that if he would, other slaves might be, the owners might find the same route and catch other slaves, and he didn't want to expose them. So a couple of themes that we saw in the book, and let's just review a couple of them. One, ignorance as a tool. How do you keep a slave? That's one thing that Frederick Douglass teaches. What are the psychological things? One, don't tell them their birth date or who their birth parents are. Separate them. Because when you do that, you rob the person of their individual identity and their natural familial feeling. So they now feel as a property instead of a human person. Two, prevent them from reading and writing. Now there's two reasons for this. One is because it makes the slaves question the right of the slave owners to own them, and two, it prevents the slaves from actually communicating to the outside world of the conditions they live in. Knowledge as a path to freedom. He also says knowledge is the way you escape a lot of this. And the reason for that is because of a new consciousness. When you find out in what state you're in, you get a new consciousness where you realize you might not be a slave anymore, you're just a man. Now that's good because it gives you hope, but it's also bad. Because now you realize that your master was unjust to you, and you start to loathe him. And what's even worse is you realize not only do you loathe him, but you can't escape. And finally, and this one was new to me, slavery is detrimental to slave owners. And we saw that in Sophia Auld, for example, where a kind woman turns cruel and old, and her husband even turned into an alcoholic at the end of his life. nice people to cruel people. Some other examples which he had were religious people, or religious Christians back then, who still perverted their morals into thinking that they were doing the right thing. So at this point, I really encourage you guys, if you want to check out his excellent autobiography. He writes in a very humble way. He doesn't say, oh, okay, you should feel guilty. He actually makes you think, just makes you think, and approaches these principles at a neutral point, where you're thinking about them. He's not convincing you of anything. The book is called My Bondage, My Freedom, by Frederick Douglass. And if you ever feel bad about your life, that kind of helps you, make you feel good about yourself on that day. Thank you.